Welcome to this journey through one of France's most haunting and deliberately forgotten mysteries, buried deep in the Pyrenees Mountains. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will unsettle you in a way few other accounts can. Not through sensational horror, but through the slow, creeping realization that entire communities can vanish, and nations can choose amnesia over truth. We're about to delve into a mystery that spans 8 decades of silence, where an entire village in the French Pyrenees was systematically erased from maps, memories, and official records, leaving behind only ruins and whispers so disturbing that the French government maintained a wall of bureaucratic silence for generations. This is the story of Vallorcine, a name you won't find in most history books, a place that existed and then didn't, where dozens of families simply disappeared into the mountain fog, and where the few survivors were sworn to silence under threat of imprisonment. It was the year 1943. The Second World War was tearing Europe apart, and France groaned under the iron grip of Nazi occupation. The Vichy regime collaborated with their German overlords while the resistance fought desperately in the shadows. In the remote Pyrenees, along the treacherous border between France and Spain, the situation was even more complex. A deadly chess game involving French authorities, German patrols, Spanish neutrality, refugees fleeing death camps, and smugglers who'd worked these mountain passes for centuries. But in one particular valley, in a village so remote that mail arrived only twice weekly by mule train, something far darker was unfolding. Something that would make the authorities decide that Vallorcine was better forgotten than explained. The Pyrenees are not gentle mountains. They rise abruptly from both the French and Spanish plains, a jagged wall of limestone and granite that has separated two nations for millennia. These are not the rounded, welcoming peaks of older mountain ranges worn smooth by time. These are teeth, sharp, unforgiving, still geologically young enough to hold grudges. In winter, avalanches roar down their flanks without warning, burying entire valleys under tons of snow and ice. In summer, violent thunderstorms materialize from nothing, turning narrow trails into death traps where one misplaced step means a 1,000-foot fall onto rocks that have claimed countless victims over the centuries. There, nestled in a valley so narrow that direct sunlight reached it for only 4 hours each day, even in midsummer, lay Vallorcine. The village was old, no one knew exactly how old. Some records suggested it dated to the 14th century, established by shepherds who needed summer grazing lands for their flocks. Others whispered it was older still, that the stone foundations of the oldest buildings predated Christianity itself, remnants of some Celtic or Iberian settlement lost to history. By 1943, Vallorcine housed approximately 180 souls. The exact number fluctuated. In winter, some families descended to lower elevations. In summer, seasonal workers arrived for the alpine pastures. The village consisted of perhaps 40 stone buildings clustered around a small church with a slate roof that reflected the sky like dark water. Most structures were built in the traditional Pyrenean style: thick walls of gray limestone, small windows with heavy wooden shutters, steep pitched roofs designed to shed snow. The streets, if you could call them that, were narrow passages between buildings, paved with irregular stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. Water came from a spring on the mountainside above the village, channeled through wooden troughs that dated back generations. The spring never froze, even in the deepest winter, and never ran dry, even in the hottest summer. The villagers considered it sacred, blessed by some power older than the church. They still left offerings at the spring's source: wildflowers in summer, pine boughs in winter, sometimes a twist of bread or a cup of milk. Old traditions died hard in the Pyrenees. The people of Vallorcine were by necessity hardy. Men worked as shepherds, foresters, and smugglers, the 3 traditional occupations of the High Pyrenees, and often all 3 at once. Women managed the households, tended gardens that produced little in the rocky soil, made cheese from sheep and goat milk, and wove wool into the thick blankets necessary for survival. Children learned early to navigate the mountain trails, to read weather signs in the clouds, to respect the mountain's power. The village was isolated by design as much as geography. The only road, barely worthy of the name, was a rutted track that switched back down the mountain for 12 kilometers before joining a proper road in the valley below. In winter, this track became impassable for months. Supplies were brought up by mule train, and the villagers stockpiled grain, preserved meat and firewood to survive the long isolation. They were accustomed to being cut off from the outside world. Indeed, many preferred it that way. But isolation also bred secrecy. And secrets, when allowed to fester in the dark, grow monstrous. The village maintained traditions that troubled the occasional priest who visited from the lower valleys. The women still recited charms over sick livestock in a language that wasn't quite French, wasn't quite Spanish, wasn't quite anything the priests recognized. The men still followed moon phases for planting and harvesting, consulted the patterns of animal entrails before major decisions, marked doorways with symbols that made the priests uncomfortable. When questioned, the villagers smiled politely and changed nothing. There were other customs too. Older ones, darker ones. Every 7 years, on the night of the spring equinox, the village held a ceremony at the spring. No outsiders were permitted. No one spoke of what occurred there. Afterward, one family would always leave the village. Voluntarily, they said, seeking opportunities in the cities. These departures were accepted without question by the remaining villagers. The family's home would be cleansed with fire and smoke, then reoccupied by another family, usually newlyweds or a household that had outgrown their dwelling. Records are sparse. Vallorcine kept few written documents, and those that existed were maintained by the village elder, not by any official authority, but piecing together fragments from regional archives reveals a pattern. Approximately every 7 years, from at least the 1850s onward, a family vanished from Vallorcine. Sometimes it was a couple with children. Sometimes it was an extended family unit, grandparents, parents, children. Sometimes it was a widower living alone. The pattern was irregular enough to avoid obvious suspicion, yet consistent enough that, once noticed, it became impossible to ignore. In 1943, Vallorcine was under the nominal authority of the Vichy government, though in practice, like much of the remote Pyrenees, it governed itself. The German occupiers rarely ventured into these inhospitable mountains. Their attention focused on the coastlines, the cities, the industrial centers. The Pyrenees were left to the French authorities, who understood that maintaining order in these remote regions meant allowing certain accommodations with local custom. But 1943 was also the year the war turned decisively against the Axis powers. Allied victories in North Africa and the Soviet Union emboldened the French resistance. The Pyrenean smuggling routes, used for centuries to move contraband, now channeled Allied pilots shot down over France. Jews fleeing the death camps, resistance fighters escaping Gestapo raids, all heading for neutral Spain and safety beyond. The Germans noticed. They began increasing patrols in the border regions. They demanded greater cooperation from Vichy authorities. They wanted the smuggling routes identified and shut down. They wanted refugees captured. They wanted the mountains tamed, and that meant they wanted to know everything happening in villages like Vallorcine. In late March 1943, a German patrol reached Vallorcine. This was unusual. The village was off the main routes, up a track that barely accommodated a military vehicle. But military intelligence had identified Vallorcine as a possible way station for refugees heading to Spain. Someone had talked, perhaps under torture, perhaps for money. The Wehrmacht wanted to investigate. The patrol consisted of 12 soldiers under the command of Hauptmann Friedrich Adler, a career officer from Bavaria who'd spent the previous 2 years on the Eastern Front before being transferred to occupation duties in France. His reports, preserved in German military archives, provide a window into what followed. Adler described Vallorcine as primitive beyond belief, like stepping back 3 centuries. The villagers spoke French poorly, he noted, communicating among themselves in some regional dialect he couldn't identify. They claimed to know nothing about refugees or smuggling routes. They were shepherds, they said. They knew only their flocks, their fields, their mountains. Adler was skeptical but found no evidence of recent refugee traffic. The village had no obvious hiding places, no signs of unusual activity. The inhabitants were polite but wary, offering the soldiers bread and cheese but little conversation. After 2 days of searching, Adler prepared to leave, concluding that Vallorcine was simply too remote and too poor to be useful to smugglers. Then, on the patrol's final evening in the village, one of Adler's soldiers, a young private named Klaus Zimmermann, disappeared. According to Adler's report, Zimmermann had been posted as a sentry on the village's southern edge. When his relief came at midnight, Zimmermann was gone. His rifle lay on the ground. His footprints led toward the forest, then vanished. A search was mounted immediately. The soldiers searched through the night with flashlights and lanterns, calling Zimmerman's name, firing signal flares. The villagers claimed they'd heard and seen nothing. By dawn, Zimmerman remained missing. Adler confronted the village elder, a man named Jean-Baptiste Montel, who was approximately 70 years old, weathered as the mountains themselves, with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through rather than at you. Montel insisted the villagers knew nothing. Perhaps, he suggested, Zimmerman had become disoriented in the dark, fallen from a cliff. The mountains claimed lives without discrimination. Adler didn't believe him. He placed the entire village under arrest, confining the inhabitants to their homes under armed guard. He sent a runner down the mountain for reinforcements. Then he began a systematic search of every building, every cellar, every shed and outbuilding. What they found in the church changed everything. The church was small, as befitted the village. A single nave with perhaps 20 rough wooden pews, a stone altar, a crucifix that might have been carved centuries earlier. But beneath the church, accessed through a trapdoor behind the altar, lay a cellar the soldiers hadn't discovered in their initial search. The cellar was carved directly from the living rock, its walls showing marks of hand tools, possibly centuries old. It was cold, that bone-deep cold of deep earth that no fire can truly warm. The air smelled of damp stone and something else, something organic and unsettling. Against one wall stood wooden shelves holding clay vessels sealed with wax. Against another wall were stacks of what appeared to be blankets or clothing, but it was the far wall that held Adler's attention. There, arranged with disturbing care, were skulls. Dozens of them. Perhaps as many as 100, each placed in its own niche, carved into the rock, each marked with strange symbols painted in what appeared to be ochre or rust. Adler's report becomes less clinical at this point, more emotional. He describes the skulls as showing evidence of trauma, deliberate fractures, cut marks, signs of burning. He notes that many of the skulls are small, children's skulls, infant skulls. The clay vessels contained remains, bone fragments, teeth, what might have been desiccated tissue. Each vessel bore marks similar to those on the skulls, symbols that Adler couldn't interpret but found deeply disturbing. Pagan, he wrote. Pre-Christian, possibly related to Celtic human sacrifice cults documented by Roman historians. Among the bones, the soldiers found more recent items. A child's shoe, no more than 3 years old. A woman's wedding ring, inscribed with a date, 1935. A man's pipe, well used, personal effects, belongings of the dead. And in a corner of the cellar, partially hidden beneath one of the blanket stacks, they found Klaus Zimmermann. He was dead. His throat had been cut with what Adler described as ritualistic precision, a single deep incision from left to right, consistent with ceremonial slaughter. His body had been arranged carefully, hands folded on his chest, eyes closed. Around him, drawn on the stone floor in what was later confirmed to be Zimmermann's own blood, were more of those strange symbols, concentric circles, spirals, marks, that resembled ancient runes but matched no known runic alphabet. The soldiers reacted with predictable rage. Adler lost control of his men for several crucial minutes. They stormed from the church, weapons ready, shouting for the villagers to emerge from their homes. Some villagers complied, others barricaded themselves inside. The situation balanced on a knife's edge between interrogation and massacre. It was Jean-Baptiste Montel who stepped forward. The old man emerged from his home slowly, hands visible, posture non-threatening. He spoke to Adler in careful, heavily accented German. He asked to explain. He requested only that Adler listen before deciding what action to take. And there, in the village square, as dawn light crept down the mountains, Montel told a story that Adler would later admit haunted him for the rest of his life. "You have found our dead," Montel said, "and you believe us monsters, but you understand nothing of what you have seen." According to Montel, the practices that so horrified the Germans dated back to the time before Rome, before even the Celts. The original inhabitants of these mountains had understood something about the land itself. about the relationship between human life and the mountain's power. They had made a pact. Montel used the French word pacte, but the way he pronounced it suggested older origins, some ancestral language preserved only in ritual. The mountains demanded sacrifice, not constantly, not arbitrarily, but regularly, in exchange for the spring that never froze or dried, for protection from avalanches, for safe passage on the trails, for healthy flocks and fertile fields. The mountain required life. Blood, death given willingly, or at least acceptingly, by those who understood the ancient contract. Every 7 years, a family was chosen. The method of selection involved casting stones marked with symbols. The entire village participated, and fate decided which family would honor the pact. The chosen family understood their role. They were treated with great respect in their final weeks. A feast was held in their honor. They were given gifts, told they would join the ancestors, become part of the mountain itself, guardians of the village in death as they had been members of the community in life. On the night of the spring equinox, the ceremony was conducted. The victims, Montel insisted on calling them the honored, were drugged with a preparation made from local herbs, rendering them unconscious but alive. Their throats were cut, quickly, efficiently, by Montel himself, who held the hereditary position of ritual leader. Their blood was collected and poured onto the earth at the spring's source. Their bodies were dismembered with specific cuts, following patterns prescribed by tradition. The flesh was buried in the forest, where it would nourish the soil, the nup. Bones were cleaned, blessed, and placed in the cellar beneath the church, where they would watch over the village eternally. "We do not do this from cruelty," Montel explained. "We do this from necessity. Without the sacrifice, the mountain grows angry. The spring dries. Avalanches destroy our homes. Lightning strikes our flocks. Our children sicken and die. We have broken the pact before, twice in our recorded history. Both times, disaster followed. The first time, in 1738, 30 villagers perished when the mountainside collapsed, burying half the village. The second time, in 1847, a plague struck. Only 40 people survived. After each disaster, we renewed the pact. The mountain forgave us. We have honored the agreement ever since, and the mountain has protected us." Adler asked the obvious question, why not simply leave? Abandon the village? Montel smiled sadly. Where would we go? This is our home. These mountains are in our blood. We are part of them, as they are part of us. And who would take us? We are poor, uneducated, speaking a language few understand. Down in the valleys we would be beggars, outsiders, despised. Here, we have dignity. We have purpose. We maintain the old ways. Someone must. As for Klaus Zimmermann, Montel expressed what seemed like genuine regret. Your soldier was not meant to be part of this, but he wandered into the forest on the night of the equinox. He saw things, preparations we were making. He drew his weapon. He shouted. We could not let him leave, could not let him tell what he had seen. So we made him part of the ceremony. His death was quick, painless, respectful. He is honored now, one of our guardians. Adler's report struggles here with how to categorize what he'd heard. He notes that Montel seemed sincere, even serene, showing no recognition that he was describing murder. Indeed, serial murder spanning generations. The other villagers who'd gathered maintained expressions of calm acceptance, occasionally nodding agreement with Montel's words. No one seemed remorseful. No one seemed to understand they'd committed crimes. They are mad, Adler wrote. The entire village is collectively insane, trapped in some ancient delusion that they have rationalized and ritualized to the point where they genuinely believe they are performing necessary, even sacred acts. They are not monsters in the conventional sense. They show no sadistic pleasure, no cruelty, no malice. They are something perhaps more disturbing. True believers in a religion that demands human sacrifice, utterly convinced of their righteousness. Adler faced an impossible situation. Under military law, he had authority to execute the entire village as reprisal for Zimmermann's death. The rules of occupation were clear. Harm to German personnel required harsh punishment, often collective punishment, to discourage resistance. Villages had been burned for less, but Adler hesitated. His report reveals a man struggling with competing impulses. Part of him, the soldier, the representative of civilization, was horrified and wanted to see justice done. But another part, perhaps, the part shaped by 2 years witnessing the mechanized slaughter of the Eastern Front, found himself unexpectedly reluctant to destroy these strange, anachronistic people who killed from faith rather than hatred. He sent a detailed report down the mountain with his runner, requesting instructions from his superiors. Then he waited, maintaining guard over the village, the inhabitants confined to their homes, while trying to process what he'd discovered. The response came 4 days later. It was not what Adler expected. Senior German commanders, after consulting with Vichy officials, issued a classified order. Vallorcine was to be evacuated and sealed. The villagers were to be arrested and transported to a detention facility for psychological evaluation and potential criminal proceedings. The village itself was to be cleared of all contents and rendered permanently uninhabitable. All records of the incident were to be classified under military security protocols. No public statements were to be made. Vallorcine, for all official purposes, would cease to exist. The reasoning, according to declassified documents discovered decades later, was purely pragmatic. The German military command wanted to avoid any incident that might inflame French public opinion or provide propaganda opportunities for the resistance. A massacre of French civilians, however justified, would be problematic. But more than that, the authorities simply didn't know how to handle what they'd discovered. The villagers couldn't be tried under normal legal systems without publicity, and the publicity would be nightmarish. How do you prosecute an entire community for crimes they commit as religious duty? How do you explain to the world that a village in modern Europe was practicing human sacrifice? The solution was bureaucratic silence. Disappear the problem. Erase it from existence. The evacuation of Vallorcine began on April 12, 1943. It proceeded with eerie calm. The villagers packed what belongings they were permitted to take, clothing, photographs, a few personal items, and were marched down the mountain under armed guard. They went quietly, with dignity, occasionally singing hymns in their strange dialect. They showed no resistance, no panic, only a kind of resigned sorrow, as though they'd always known this day would eventually come. 173 people were evacuated. 7 had fled into the mountains during the initial confrontation and were never found. Presumably they died of exposure or managed to reach Spain, though no records confirm either outcome. The evacuees were taken to a facility near Toulouse, not a concentration camp, but something between a prison and a psychiatric hospital. They were separated by family groups, interviewed extensively by military psychiatrists and Vichy officials, assessed for dangerousness and competency. The interviews revealed a community whose worldview was so fundamentally different from modern European society that meaningful communication proved nearly impossible. The villagers could not be made to understand that killing was wrong. They acknowledged that modern law forbade their practices, but they viewed modern law as a temporary aberration, a brief confusion in the long history of humanity's relationship with the sacred earth. They had been doing this for centuries, perhaps millennia. How could a few decades of different rules change what was necessary? The psychiatrists declared them a collective delusional system with deep cultural roots. The legal experts declared the situation unprecedented and legally ambiguous. How do you prosecute religious practice that predates the nation itself? How do you punish people who genuinely believe they've been preventing disasters through ritual sacrifice? And crucially, given the political sensitivities of 1943, how do you do any of this without creating a public scandal? The Vichy government's solution was elegant in its efficiency. The villagers would remain in detention indefinitely, not as criminals, but as displaced persons requiring supervision for their own protection and the protection of others. They would be dispersed to various facilities, preventing them from reconstituting their community. They would be forbidden from returning to the Pyrenees. Their children would be placed in state care and re-educated. The village of Vallorcine would be destroyed, its location removed from official maps, its very existence gradually erased from memory. Meanwhile, German engineers received orders to demolish Vallorcine. They did so methodically, professionally. Buildings were dynamited. The church was blown apart, its cellar filled with rubble and sealed with concrete. The spring was capped and the water diverted. The terraced fields were churned into uselessness. The trails leading to the village were deliberately damaged, rendered impassable. Within 6 weeks, nothing remained but scattered rubble and blackened stone foundations. Hauptmann Adler's final report on the matter, dated May 28, 1943, is brief and clinical. The mission was accomplished. Vallorcine no longer existed. The security threat was eliminated. Klaus Zimmermann's death was classified as killed in action against enemy partisans, and his family received the standard notification. The report was filed, classified and forgotten, except it wasn't. Not quite, because some of the villagers survived their detention, and some of them talked. After the war, when the French Fourth Republic replaced Vichy and German occupation, the detention facilities were dismantled. The Vallorcine villagers, those who remained alive, were released. Many had died in captivity from disease, despair, or simple old age. Those who survived found themselves in a France that had no place for them. They had no village to return to. Their children had been adopted or placed in orphanages. They spoke a language few understood and held beliefs that horrified anyone who heard them. Most scattered into anonymity. They took new names, created new identities, tried to blend into the modern world they'd so successfully avoided. But a few, a stubborn, defiant few, tried to tell their story. They approached journalists, scholars, church officials. They insisted that what they'd done was not madness but necessity, not murder but obligation. They wanted their village restored. They wanted their practices acknowledged. They wanted understanding, if not acceptance. They were universally dismissed as mentally ill. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, as France struggled to rebuild from the war's devastation, there was no patience for bizarre stories about pagan sacrifice cults in the Pyrenees. The few journalists who investigated found only contradictory documents, sealed records and official denials that Vallorcine had ever existed, one persistent. Researcher, a doctoral student in anthropology named Marie Castex, became obsessed with the story in 1952. She'd encountered an elderly woman in Toulouse who claimed to be from Vallorcine and insisted that her people had been unjustly persecuted for maintaining the old obligations. Castex spent 2 years trying to verify the story. She found fragments of evidence, brief mentions in German military archives, cryptic references in Vichy administrative records, a few unmarked graves in a cemetery that corresponded to the detention facility's location. In 1954, Castex attempted to locate the physical site of Vallorcine. Using clues from the elderly woman's descriptions and old topographical maps, she narrowed the location to a particular valley in the High Pyrenees. She organized an expedition. Herself, 2 graduate students, and a mountain guide. They found ruins. Collapsed stone walls half buried in vegetation. Blast craters now softened by decades of weather and plant growth. The foundation of what might have been a church, filled with rubble and concrete. The capped spring, its water still trying to force its way to the surface, creating a small marshy area where nothing had been designed to grow. And strange marks on surviving pieces of rock, those spirals, those concentric circles, those symbols that matched nothing in her reference books. Castex documented everything with photographs and detailed notes. She excavated carefully at one site, finding pottery fragments, corroded metal objects, and, disturbingly, bone fragments that showed evidence of cut marks and deliberate breakage. Carbon dating would later confirm the bones ranged from medieval to modern periods. She wrote her dissertation on Vallorcine, presenting it as a case study in the persistence of pre-Christian religious practices in isolated European communities, and as a tragic example of how modernization violently destroys traditional cultures without understanding them. Her committee rejected it. The work was insufficiently verified, they said, too speculative, bordering on sensationalism. They suggested she choose a different topic if she wanted to receive her degree. Castex refused. She insisted her research was sound. The university responded by withdrawing her funding and expelling her from the doctoral program. Her academic career was over before it truly began, but she'd made her research public. Her dissertation, though never officially accepted, was read by other scholars. Some dismissed it, others were intrigued. A few began their own investigations. Slowly, very slowly, the story of Vallorcine began to emerge from the shadows where bureaucrats and time had tried to bury it. The full truth, or as close to the full truth, as we may ever come, emerged gradually over the following decades, piece by piece, as classified documents were declassified, as archives were digitized and made accessible, as aging survivors finally broke their imposed silence. We now know that Vallorcine existed. We have photographs of the village taken by Adler's soldiers. We have the detailed reports of the cellar's contents, including inventories of the skulls and bones. We have transcripts of interviews with the detained villagers. We have geological surveys confirming the spring's existence and unusual properties. It emerges from a deep aquifer with mineral content suggesting underground thermal activity, which would explain why it never freezes. We know that at least 73 people died in detention between 1943 and 1948. We know that another 37 were released but died within 5 years. Suicide, illness, accidents, at rates far exceeding statistical norms. We know that the handful of Vallorcine children who survived were systematically prevented from learning about their origins, told their parents had been criminals or resistance fighters, given false family histories. What we don't know, what we can never know with certainty, is the most disturbing question of all. Were the villagers right? This sounds absurd. Obviously, human sacrifice doesn't control avalanches or prevent droughts. There's no mechanism by which ritual murder could influence geological or meteorological phenomena. The villagers' beliefs were superstition, delusion, the persistence of primitive thinking into the modern age. And yet, after Vallorcine was destroyed, the region experienced unusual natural disasters. In 1947, a massive avalanche struck a valley 7 kilometers from where Vallorcine had stood, killing 24 people in 2 lower villages. In 1951, an unprecedented drought affected the Pyrenees, causing springs and streams to dry up for the first time in recorded history. In 1956, a lightning storm ignited forest fires that burned for 3 weeks, consuming thousands of hectares. In 1963, a section of mountainside collapsed without warning, diverting a river and destroying a small hydroelectric facility. Coincidence, certainly. Climate variation, geological instability, statistical clustering of random events. But the few surviving Vallorcine villagers, when they heard about these disasters, nodded with grim satisfaction. The mountain is angry, they said. The pact is broken. Balance must be restored. Several made attempts to return to the site. All were stopped by authorities. The area around the former village was declared off-limits due to geological instability, though no formal studies supported this designation. Signs were posted, fences were erected. Local guides were informally warned not to take tourists near the ruins. The official story was that unexploded ordnance from the war might remain in the area, making it dangerous. But hikers who ignored the warnings and ventured into the valley reported strange experiences. Compasses malfunctioning, a sense of being watched, sounds with no visible source, and a pervasive feeling of wrongness that drove them away. Marie Castex returned to the site multiple times throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Her later writings, published in obscure journals after mainstream academia rejected her work, describe progressively stranger observations. She claimed to have found fresh offerings at the capped spring, wildflowers, pine boughs, bread, milk, exactly the items Montel had described in his testimony. She documented symbols painted on rocks with what appeared to be blood. She recorded audio that she claimed contained chanting in the old dialect, occurring at night when no one was supposed to be in the area. In 1978, Castex disappeared while on one of her research trips. Her body was found 3 weeks later at the base of a cliff 2 kilometers from the Vallorcine ruins. The official verdict was accidental death. She'd fallen while hiking alone. But her research notes, found in her abandoned campsite, told a different story. Her final entries described encountering the last guardians, elderly individuals who claimed to be survivors from Vallorcine, who'd secretly returned to maintain the rituals, who still believed in the pact and were trying to uphold it despite the village's destruction. They say the mountain still demands blood, Castex wrote in her final entry. They say someone must honor the old agreement or the disasters will continue, will worsen. They've asked me to join them in the ceremony. They say an outsider's willing sacrifice would have tremendous power, would prove to the mountain that the pact is not forgotten. I don't believe in their mythology, but I believe in their sincerity. I believe in the importance of preserving their knowledge, their traditions, even the dark ones. Tomorrow I'll witness their ritual, Whatever I find will revolutionize our understanding of European paganism. There was no tomorrow entry. The French government's response to Castex's death was to further restrict access to the area. The entire valley was declared a nature preserve with strict limitations on human presence. Official documentation cited ecological concerns, protecting endangered plant species, preventing erosion, maintaining watershed integrity. But the practical effect was to ensure that virtually no one could legally visit the Vallorcine ruins without special permits that were never granted. The last documented survivor of Vallorcine died in 1984, an elderly woman named Camille Roche, who'd been 19 when the village was evacuated. Before her death, she gave a final interview to a local historian. She was lucid, precise, unapologetic. "We did what was necessary," she said. "We maintained the balance. We honored our obligations. The modern world calls us murderers, but who has killed more? My village, taking 7 lives every 7 years, or your wars and your progress? We took only what the mountain required, and we did it with respect, with ceremony, with understanding. Now the pact is broken. Now the mountain takes what it wants, when it wants, without ceremony or respect. The avalanches, the fires, the floods, these are the mountain's rage at being abandoned. We tried to warn them. We tried to make them understand, but they wouldn't listen." When asked if she felt remorse for those who'd been sacrificed, her response was chilling in its simplicity. They were part of something larger than themselves. They were honored. Their deaths had meaning. "Can you say the same for the millions who died in your wars? For the victims of your automobiles, your factories, your progress? We killed from necessity and transformed death into meaning. You kill from carelessness and call it civilization." She died 3 days after that interview. According to the death certificate, the cause was heart failure. But the historian who interviewed her, a man named Philippe Moreau, later wrote that Roche seemed to die by choice, as if she'd held on just long enough to bear witness one final time, and then simply released her grip on life. Moreau attempted to have Roche's testimony included in regional historical archives. His request was denied. The official response stated that unverified oral histories from individuals with documented psychological issues do not meet archival standards for inclusion. The interview recording and transcript were returned to Moreau, who published them in a limited circulation journal devoted to Pyrenean folklore. Few people read it. Fewer took it seriously, and yet the questions persist. The stories continue. Local guides still avoid that particular valley. Hikers still report strange experiences. And every 7 years without fail, mysterious offerings appear at the sealed spring. Flowers, bread, pine boughs, sometimes a cup of milk, left by someone who remembers, or who has been taught to remember, the old obligations. In 2019, the French government quietly allocated funds to enhance security measures around the former Vallorcine site. New fences were erected. Security cameras were installed. Official statements cited concerns about vandalism and illegal camping, but locals whispered different explanations. They spoke of researchers who'd ventured too close and disappeared, of strange lights seen in the valley at night, especially around the spring equinox, of sounds, chanting, singing, rhythmic drumming, that echoed down from the mountains when the wind was right. The most disturbing incident occurred in March 2020, just as the COVID-19 pandemic began to grip Europe. A group of 5 hikers ignored the posted warnings and entered the restricted area. They were experienced mountaineers, well-equipped, following GPS coordinates they'd obtained from someone in an online forum dedicated to abandoned places. They intended to document the ruins, to capture photographs for their social media accounts. Only 3 returned. The survivors gave confused, contradictory accounts to police. They'd become separated in fog that appeared suddenly, despite clear weather forecasts. They'd heard voices calling their names. They'd seen figures moving between the ruins, people in old-fashioned clothing watching but not approaching. When the fog cleared hours later, their 2 companions were gone. Extensive searches found nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no trace. The incident was officially classified as a hiking accident. The missing individuals fell, were swept away by a stream, suffered some misfortune that left no recoverable evidence. But the 3 survivors insisted otherwise. They described a presence in that valley, something ancient and aware, something that tolerated brief visits but resented intrusion. They described feeling watched, judged, found wanting. One of the survivors, a woman named Elise Bertrand, became obsessed with understanding what had happened. She spent months researching, eventually discovering the story of Vallorcine, connecting the ruins they'd explored with the village's dark history. In a blog post published 6 months after the incident, Bertrand wrote, "I think they're still there. Not the villagers, they're long dead, but something remains. The pact wasn't made with the mountain in a metaphorical sense. It was made with something that lives in the mountain, or is the mountain, or uses the mountain as its body." The villagers understood this. They'd found a way to coexist with it, to give it what it wanted in exchange for protection. When the village was destroyed, the agreement was broken, but the other party, whatever it is, didn't leave. It's still there, still waiting, still expecting what it's owed, and when it doesn't get what it expects, it takes what it wants. Marie Castex understood this at the end. That's why she went to that ceremony. That's why she died. She was trying to fulfill the pact, even if she didn't fully believe in it, because she understood that some things are older than belief, more fundamental than faith. Bertrand's blog post generated significant attention in online communities devoted to unexplained phenomena, conspiracy theories, and dark tourism. Several people announced intentions to visit the Vallorcine ruins themselves, to investigate, to prove or disprove Bertrand's claims. French authorities responded by increasing patrols and prosecuting trespassers with unusual vigor. The message was clear: stay away. Today, more than 80 years after Vallorcine's destruction, the valley remains sealed. The village's location appears on no tourist maps, no hiking guides, no official documentation. If you ask local authorities about it, they'll claim ignorance or redirect you to other destinations. If you ask older locals, the generation that heard stories from their grandparents, they'll usually refuse to discuss it, or they'll tell you it's better left alone, that some places carry too much history, too much darkness, too much of whatever it is that humans shouldn't disturb. The scholarly consensus, to the extent one exists, treats Vallorcine as a cautionary tale about cultural relativism. Here was a community that maintained practices so far outside acceptable norms that their very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about human society. The traditional response would be moral condemnation. They were murderers, full stop. But the Vallorcine case resists such simple categorization. These were not sadistic killers. They were not driven by hatred or greed. They were, by all accounts, ordinary people most of the time, shepherds, farmers, parents, neighbors, who happened to believe that periodic human sacrifice was necessary for their community's survival. They'd inherited this belief from ancestors stretching back into prehistory. They'd built an entire cosmology around it, complete with rituals, symbols, and theological justifications. Within their worldview, what they did made perfect sense. It was logical. It was ethical. It was necessary. This doesn't make it right, but it makes it comprehensible in a way that random violence or pathological killing is not. The villagers of Vallorcine weren't monsters. They were humans doing what humans have done throughout history, creating meaning from existence, finding patterns in chaos, and constructing systems of belief that help them navigate an uncertain world. The tragedy is that their system required death, and that the modern world had no framework for understanding or accommodating such a fundamental difference in worldview. The questions that Vallorcine raises remain unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. How do we judge practices that predate our moral systems? What do we owe to cultural traditions that conflict with universal human rights? When does tolerance become complicity? When does moral progress become cultural erasure? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They have real consequences for how we engage with indigenous peoples, religious minorities, and anyone whose beliefs challenge mainstream assumptions. And then there's the other question, the one that haunts those who've truly engaged with the Vallorcine story. What if they weren't entirely wrong? Not about human sacrifice being necessary, that's superstition, surely, but about something deeper, about the relationship between humans and the land, about obligations that extend beyond human society, about forces or patterns or aspects of reality that our modern rationalized worldview has dismissed, but not necessarily disproven. The disasters that followed Vallorcine's destruction could be coincidence, probably are coincidence, but they could also be what happens when an equilibrium, however disturbing, is disrupted without understanding what maintained it. The villagers believed they were preventing catastrophe through their rituals. When the rituals stopped, catastrophes occurred. Correlation doesn't prove causation, but it doesn't disprove it either. Perhaps what's most unsettling about Vallorcine is how it exposes the fragility of our certainties. We're so confident in our scientific understanding, our moral frameworks, our technological mastery of nature. We're so certain that we've progressed beyond the primitive thinking of our ancestors. But Vallorcine suggests that there might be things we've forgotten rather than things we've learned. Practices we've abandoned, not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. Knowledge we've lost because it was too disturbing to maintain. The story of Vallorcine remains a disturbing reminder that the past is not as distant as we imagine, that the mountains hold secrets older than nations, and that sometimes the price of forgetting is higher than the cost of remembering. But questions remain. What happened to the 7 villagers who fled into the mountains and were never found? Did they die of exposure, or did they reach Spain and build new lives under new names? Are there descendants of Vallorcine scattered across France and Spain, carrying genetic memory of the old practices, perhaps still feeling drawn to mountains they've never seen, perhaps still leaving offerings at springs without understanding why? What about those mysterious offerings that continue to appear at the sealed spring every 7 years? Who leaves them? How do they access a restricted area under surveillance? What do they hope to accomplish? Are they descendants maintaining tradition? Or modern practitioners of reconstructed paganism? Or something else entirely, believers in the pact, still trying to honor it? Still trying to maintain balance with whatever presence dwells in those mountains? And what about the missing hikers from 2020? Extensive searches found nothing, but the valley is vast, filled with crevasses and caves and places where bodies could remain hidden indefinitely. Or perhaps they found something that changed them, made them part of something older, drew them into a pattern that began long before they were born and continues still, regardless of laws or fences or our insistence that such things can't be real. To this day, the restricted area around Vallorcine remains one of the few places in Western Europe where humans are actively prevented from going. Not for environmental protection or military security, but for reasons the authorities won't fully articulate. The official explanations, unstable geology, unexploded ordnance, endangered species, don't quite hold up to scrutiny. The real reason might be simpler and more disturbing. They don't know what's there, and they're afraid to find out. And on silent nights, when the wind blows down from the peaks and carries with it the scent of wet stone and ancient earth, when the spring equinox approaches and something in the air feels different, expectant, waiting, people still report hearing sounds from that sealed valley, chanting in a language no one speaks anymore, drumming that follows rhythms older than music, voices calling in the darkness, offering invitations that no one dares to accept. The village France abandoned continues to exert its presence, demanding recognition, refusing to be forgotten. Vallorcine is gone but not absent, destroyed but not dead, silenced but still speaking to those willing to listen. The pact may be broken, but the other party to that agreement has not released France from its obligations. The mountain remembers. The spring still flows beneath its concrete cap, still trying to reach the surface, still waiting for the offerings it expects. And somewhere in those ruins, among the collapsed stones and the overgrown foundations and the symbols painted on rock faces by unknown hands, the past patiently waits for the future to understand what was lost when certainty triumphed over wisdom, when progress destroyed what it couldn't comprehend, when an entire nation chose amnesia over the disturbing possibility that their ancestors, however primitive, however violent, however wrong they seem, might have understood something fundamental that we've forgotten. If this journey through the mountains of silence has moved you, if you find yourself pondering the questions that Vallorcine raises about tradition and modernity, about the price we pay for progress, about what we lose when we destroy what we don't understand, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting in the shadows of history, mysteries that challenge our assumptions and force us to question what we think we know about the past and ourselves. What the official records don't reveal, what couldn't be revealed without acknowledging the truth of what happened, is that Vallorcine never truly died. You can destroy buildings, you can scatter people, you can erase names from maps and seal documents in classified archives, but you cannot kill an idea, especially one that has taken root over centuries, especially one that believers consider not merely tradition but cosmic necessity. In the decades following the village's destruction, something unexpected occurred. The scattered survivors didn't simply vanish into anonymity as the authorities had hoped. Instead, they maintained contact through clandestine channels, coded letters, messages passed through trusted intermediaries, occasional secret gatherings in remote locations where no officials would think to look. They preserved their language, teaching it to their children in whispers. They maintained their calendar, marking the sacred dates, remembering the rituals even if they could no longer perform them fully, and they recruited. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Vallorcine's aftermath, discovered only recently through documents obtained by investigative journalists under Freedom of Information requests. The authorities had assumed that the belief system would die with the original villagers, that children raised outside the community would integrate into modern French society and forget the old ways. They were wrong. The children of Vallorcine grew up haunted. They'd been told their parents were criminals, that the old beliefs were delusions, that the village had been a place of horror that deserved to be forgotten. But children know when they're being lied to, when the official story doesn't match the emotions they see in adults' eyes. They knew their parents weren't monsters. They'd felt the love, seen the community bonds, experienced the sense of purpose that permeated Vallorcine life. And so they questioned. They searched. They found each other. By the 1970s, a second generation had formed what they called la mémoire, the memory. It wasn't quite a cult, wasn't quite a cultural preservation society, wasn't quite a religious organization. It existed in the spaces between legal categories, carefully avoiding actions that would trigger official intervention while maintaining the core of Vallorcine's belief system. They met annually on the spring equinox, not at Vallorcine itself, too closely watched, but at other remote locations in the Pyrenees. They performed modified versions of the rituals, substituting animal sacrifice for human, telling themselves this was enough to maintain the pact, knowing in their hearts it probably wasn't. La Mémoire attracted not just descendants of Vallorcine, but also outsiders, academics fascinated by surviving pagan practices, neo-pagans seeking authentic pre-Christian traditions, disaffected individuals looking for meaning in an increasingly rationalized world, and, disturbingly, a few who were drawn to the darkness itself, who found in Vallorcine's story a justification for their own violent impulses. The group's leadership, composed primarily of descendants who remembered the original village, who'd been children when it was destroyed, worked hard to maintain ideological purity. They rejected those who sought Vallorcine's practices as an excuse for cruelty or power. They emphasized that the sacrifices had never been about death for its own sake, but about maintaining balance, honoring obligations, participating in cycles larger than individual human life. But as the original descendants aged and died, control became increasingly difficult. By the 1990s, La Mémoire had fractured into multiple groups with competing interpretations of Vallorcine's legacy. One faction, calling itself Les Gardiens Authentiques, the Authentic Guardians, insisted that only the original practices, including human sacrifice, could truly honor the pact. They argued that the natural disasters plaguing the Pyrenees, the avalanches, fires, floods, landslides, were proof that substitutes weren't sufficient, that the mountain demanded what it had always been owed. This group remained small, perhaps 20 to 30 members at most, but they were fervent, absolute in their conviction, and, according to intelligence reports that wouldn't be declassified until 2018, potentially dangerous. French authorities became aware of Les Gardiens Authentiques in 1997 after intercepting communications that suggested the group was preparing for the restoration of proper practice. Surveillance was initiated. What investigators discovered was chilling. The group had been studying the original Vallorcine rituals in detail, had recreated the symbols and prayers, had even obtained what they claimed were sacred objects salvaged from the village before its destruction. Stones from the church, dirt from the spring source, bone fragments from the cellar more disturbingly. The group had been conducting what they called feasibility assessments, identifying potential victims, studying their movements, determining how sacrifices could be performed without immediate detection. The intercepted communication spoke of volunteers, suggesting the group believed they could find people willing to be sacrificed. Whether such volunteers existed, or whether this was self-delusion masking plans for murder, remained unclear. The authorities faced the same problem their predecessors had encountered in 1943. How do you prosecute belief? The group hadn't actually committed any crimes. They'd discussed crimes, planned crimes, prepared for crimes, but in a democracy with free speech protections, discussion and planning aren't sufficient for prosecution unless they cross into concrete conspiracy. The investigators debated preemptive action, worried about another Vallorcine emerging, about modern human sacrifices being performed in the Pyrenees. But ultimately, they chose surveillance over intervention, watching and waiting for the group to either disperse harmlessly or cross a legal line that would justify arrest. They never got the chance. In March 2005, on the spring equinox, all communications from Les Gardiens Authentiques ceased. The safe house where they'd been meeting was found abandoned. Their vehicles were parked outside, keys in ignitions. Personal belongings remained, clothing, books, supplies, suggesting the occupants had left suddenly or been taken suddenly. The 23 members of the group had simply vanished. Extensive investigation revealed nothing. No bodies, no evidence of foul play, no indication they'd fled abroad, no passport stamps, no financial transactions, no digital trail. They'd gone to their meeting place and then they'd ceased to exist in any traceable way. The official conclusion was that the group had dissolved and its members had scattered, probably planning to regroup elsewhere under new identities. But the investigating officers privately expressed doubt. People don't vanish that completely, that suddenly, that thoroughly, unless, some whispered, they'd finally gone to Vallorcine itself. Unless they'd decided that the only way to properly restore the practices was to return to the original site, to the spring, to the place where the pact had first been made. Unless they'd gone to perform the ceremony they'd been planning, using themselves as the sacrifice, offering their own blood to prove their devotion and restart the ancient agreement. This theory led to another search of the restricted area around Vallorcine. What searchers found supported the theory while simultaneously making it more mysterious. At the sealed spring, fresh offerings, flowers, bread, pine boughs, and yes, blood. DNA analysis confirmed the blood came from multiple individuals, consistent with the missing group members. Symbols had been painted on rocks throughout the ruins. Not old faded marks, but fresh applications done with what appeared to be blood mixed with ochre. And in what had been the church cellar, now supposedly filled with rubble and sealed with concrete, someone had excavated a passage, dug down through the fill material, reopened access to the chamber beneath. Inside, investigators found evidence of recent ceremony. Candles burned down to stubs, the smell of incense still hanging in the air. More blood, pooled in carved channels in the stone floor that hadn't been visible in the 1943 photographs, but must have always been there, hidden beneath centuries of accumulated dust and debris. And carved into the cellar wall, in fresh cuts that exposed pale stone beneath the weathered surface, a message in French. The pact is renewed. The balance is restored. The guardians have returned to their posts. Let those with understanding honor what has been done. Let those without understanding stay away, for the mountain is satisfied but not forgiving. But no bodies. No physical evidence of the 23 missing individuals beyond their blood. Just the message, the symbols, and the unsettling certainty that something had occurred in that cellar. Some ceremony had been completed, and the participants had gone somewhere, joined something, become something. The authorities' response was to further seal the site, this time with more extreme measures. The entire cellar was filled with concrete, not just capped, but completely filled from floor to ceiling, obliterating the chamber entirely. The spring was not merely capped, but had multiple tons of rock dumped over it, burying it under an artificial landslide. The entire area was surrounded with new fencing, this time serious security infrastructure including motion sensors, cameras, and regular patrols. The official explanation cited archaeological preservation and public safety, but everyone involved understood the real purpose. Prevent anyone else from attempting what Les Gardiens Authentiques had done. It didn't work. Every 7 years since 2005, in 2012, 2019, and as recently as 2026, just months ago, security systems at Vallorcine have detected intrusions. Every time by the time patrols arrive, the intruders are gone. Every time fresh offerings appear at the buried spring, somehow placed despite the tons of rock covering it. Every time, new symbols are painted on surfaces that were blank the previous inspection. And every time there's blood. Always human blood. Always from multiple donors. Always deposited with ceremonial precision. DNA analysis of these blood samples has revealed something that keeps investigators awake at night. Some of the DNA matches the missing members of Les Gardiens Authentiques. Not matches to their children or relatives, matches to them personally, as if they're still alive, still active, still performing rituals more than 20 years after they vanished. The official position is that the DNA database was contaminated, that the matches are false positives, that there's some mundane explanation. But the investigators themselves don't believe this. They've checked and rechecked. The matches are solid, which means either Les Gardiens Authentiques survived their 2005 ceremony and have been hiding in the mountains for 2 decades, emerging every 7 years to perform rituals, or something even stranger is occurring. The latter possibility is what haunts those familiar with the full Vallorcine file. Because there's a pattern in the old village records that Marie Castex identified but couldn't explain. The names of ritual leaders repeated across generations in ways that didn't match normal genealogy. Jean-Baptiste Montet, the elder who explained the pact to Hauptmann Adler in 1943, shared not just a name but physical descriptions with a Jean-Baptiste Montet mentioned in church records from 1847, and another from 1793, and another from 1738. The same name, the same role, appearing again and again across more than 2 centuries. Castex theorized that Jean-Baptiste Montet might be a title rather than a name, passed from one ritual leader to the next. But some of her later more speculative writings suggested another possibility, that the ritual leaders didn't die as others did, that their participation in the ceremonies somehow altered them, made them something more than human, something tied to the mountain itself, something that persisted across normal human lifespans. It's an insane theory. It has to be insane. But it would explain the DNA matches. It would explain how the same individuals could perform ceremonies decades apart. It would explain the testimonies from multiple sources describing encounters with people in the Vallorcine area who seem wrong, moving in strange ways, speaking in archaic dialects, appearing and disappearing without traveling the distance between, watching from the ruins with eyes that reflect light like an animal's. In 2023, a documentary filmmaker named Thomas Arnaud obtained special permission to visit the Vallorcine site under strict supervision. He was researching a film about abandoned villages in France and had managed to convince authorities that a brief, controlled visit would help preserve historical memory while respecting the site's sensitivity. What he filmed during his 4-hour supervised visit has never been publicly released. Though portions were provided to authorities, Arnaud's footage shows the ruins much as expected, overgrown, collapsed, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But it also captures something else. In several frames, barely visible in the background, there are figures. They appear human at first glance, people in old-fashioned clothing, moving between the ruins. But they don't behave like people. They don't react to the film crew's presence. They don't follow normal physics, appearing in one location in one frame, then somewhere else entirely in the next frame without crossing the intervening space. Arnaud initially dismissed these as equipment glitches or tricks of light. But when he reviewed the footage carefully, he noticed patterns. The figures appeared at specific locations, near the buried spring, at the former church site, along a trail leading up the mountainside. They moved with purpose as if following routines, performing tasks that made sense to them but were invisible to observers. And in one brief disturbing sequence, one of the figures turns and looks directly at the camera. The face is human but wrong somehow. Features slightly too symmetric, expression slightly too neutral, eyes that seem to see past the camera, past Arnaud, past the present moment entirely. Arnaud included none of this in his documentary. Instead, he shelved the entire project, telling colleagues he'd found nothing interesting at Vallorcine. But privately, in conversations recorded by investigators monitoring him as a potential security risk, he expressed terror. "They're still there," he told a friend. "Not ghosts, something else. Still performing their roles, still maintaining the village, still following the routines, even though the village is gone. Like they can't stop, or won't stop, or don't understand that they're supposed to stop. And I think they wanted me to see them. I think they wanted me to know they're still there, still keeping the pact, still doing what they believe needs to be done." Arnaud refused all subsequent requests to discuss his Vallorcine visit. In 2024, he moved to Quebec, as far from the Pyrenees as he could manage while remaining in the Francophone world. He will not return to France, he says, because they know who I am now, and they might need someone for the next ceremony. This brings us to the present moment, to March 2026, to the most recent intrusion at Vallorcine, detected just 3 months ago, during which something different occurred. The usual pattern held. Intruders somehow bypassed security. Offerings appeared, symbols were painted, blood was deposited. But this time, a patrol arrived while the ceremony was apparently still in progress. Officers reported seeing approximately a dozen figures arranged in a circle around the buried spring, all wearing hooded robes, all chanting in unison. When the officers called out, the figures didn't flee. They didn't even acknowledge the officers' presence. They simply continued their ritual. The officers approached, intending to make arrests. And then, according to their reports, which have been classified but leaked through various channels, the figures simply stopped being there. Not running away, not disappearing in a flash, just ceasing to be present. One moment visible, the next moment gone, with nothing in between. And the chanting continued, clearly audible, even though no one was visible to produce the sound. The officers retreated. They're trained for various threats, but not for whatever this was. They called for backup. By the time additional units arrived an hour later, the chanting had stopped. The offerings remained. The blood remained. Fresh symbols covered surfaces, but nothing else. No footprints beyond those left by the initial patrol. No forensic evidence of how many people had been present or where they'd gone. Since that incident, security measures at Vallorcine have been upgraded yet again. But there's a growing sense among those responsible for monitoring the site that physical security is irrelevant. You can't fence out what's already there. You can't patrol against what might not be entirely physical. You can't prevent ceremonies performed by participants who may no longer be entirely human, or may never leave, or may exist in some state that normal rules don't apply to. The current debate within French security services, a debate that officially doesn't exist, is whether Vallorcine should be left alone entirely. Some argue that attempts to seal and control the site have been counterproductive, that the intrusions and ceremonies continue regardless of security measures, that perhaps the best approach is to simply acknowledge that something persists there, something that predates the French state and will outlast it, something that will maintain its practices regardless of law or force. Others argue this represents surrender to superstition, that a modern nation cannot simply cede territory to whatever strange phenomenon persists at Vallorcine, that continued vigilance and scientific study will eventually reveal mundane explanations for everything that's occurred. But a third position has emerged, whispered in late-night conversations, never officially proposed but increasingly considered. Perhaps Vallorcine's original inhabitants were right. Not about the supernatural aspects necessarily, but about the practical reality. Perhaps there is something about that particular location, some geological feature, some electromagnetic phenomenon, some aspect of the environment that science doesn't yet understand, that requires management. Perhaps the rituals and sacrifices were a primitive but effective way of managing whatever that something is. And perhaps, by destroying Vallorcine and preventing the practices, modern France inadvertently removed a safeguard whose purpose was never understood. The natural disasters continue. The Pyrenees experience statistically anomalous rates of avalanches, landslides, floods, and fires, concentrated disproportionately in the region around Vallorcine. Climate change explains some of this. Geological instability explains more. But the pattern holds, and those who know the full history can't help but notice that the disasters began after the village was destroyed, intensified after the spring was sealed, and occur with particular severity in the years when the 7-year cycle would traditionally demand sacrifice. Correlation isn't causation. Everyone knows this. But everyone also knows that correlation sometimes indicates causation we don't yet understand. And so Vallorcine persists, not as a village but as a question, as a wound in the landscape that won't heal, as a reminder that the past doesn't stay buried, that some things transcend our ability to control or comprehend them, that perhaps the ancient peoples knew things we've forgotten in our rush toward progress and rationality. The village France abandoned has never truly been abandoned. It's still there, still occupied, still following rhythms established centuries ago. The inhabitants are gone but also present, lost but also found, dead but also persistent. The pact was broken but also maintained. The ceremonies were stopped but also continue. And the mountain, patient, eternal, unconcerned with human categories of possible and impossible, still waits for what it's owed, still remembers what was promised, still expects what it has always expected. Every 7 years, on the spring equinox, when the veil between worlds grows thin and old powers stir beneath the mountains, something gathers at Vallorcine. Something performs the rites. Something maintains the balance. And whether this something is human or was once human or has never been human at all, it persists, fulfilling obligations that predate nations and will outlast them, keeping promises made so long ago that even the memory of making them has been forgotten by everyone except those who still keep them. France abandoned Vallorcine. But Vallorcine has never abandoned France. It's still there, watching from the mountains, waiting in the ruins, whispering in the wind. And when the next spring equinox arrives, when the offerings appear and the symbols are painted and the blood is spilled, the mountain will be satisfied for another 7 years. The disasters will pause. The balance will hold. The pact will remain unbroken, because some things cannot be destroyed. Some knowledge cannot be lost. Some obligations cannot be shirked. And some places once made sacred or profane, for perhaps they're the same thing, remain that way forever, regardless of whether anyone living still believes, still understands, still remembers why. The guardians have returned to their posts. The village France abandoned is more present than ever, and in the Pyrenees, in a valley no map shows. In ruins no tourist visits, the old ways continue, maintained by hands that may not be entirely human anymore, witnessed by eyes that may see more than one reality at once, honored by beliefs that refuse to die simply because the modern world insists they must. Welcome to Vallorcine, the village that exists and doesn't exist, the place that ended and continues, the mystery that was solved and remains unsolved. Welcome to the place France chose to forget, and the place that refuses to let France forget. Welcome to the Untold Hour.